Welcome to Sanctuary Peacemakers, where we discuss all things related to security inside houses of worship with your host, Unity. Now, let's enter the crucible of our discussion. Welcome back to Sanctuary Peacemakers. Today's episode is one of our heaviest. We're talking about what happens after mass shootings or mass casualty events that target houses of worship. This episode is not only about forensic timelines, police reports, and media coverage. It's about people, survivors, families, first responders, pastors, and whole congregations trying to breathe again after the unthinkable. We'll follow the arc of an incident from the moment the violence stops or the suspect is caught or killed, through the frantic hours when decisions are being made, through investigations, family notifications, funerals, and the months and years when grief, fear, and sometimes resilience settle in. I'll also interweave statistics and direct quotes from survivors and experts so we can ground our conversation in facts and not just abstract fear. A content note: this episode contains descriptions of violent events and may be triggering for some listeners. If you need immediate help after listening, you'll hear hotline and resource references throughout, and I'll repeat phone numbers and sites near the end of the show. Let's begin at ground zero, the minutes in the first several hours after a shooting inside the house of worship. What actually happens, logistically and emotionally, in that immediate aftermath? First, medical triage and life-saving. In many mass casualty incidents, bystanders and congregants are the first medical responders. People perform CPR, use tourniquets, or improvise stopping the bleed techniques. Survivors of the 2017 Sutherland Springs, Texas church attack described playing dead, trying to shelter others, and doing what they could to help the wounded. As one survivor, Roseanne Solis, later told reporters, "I'm going to die. I knew I was going to die." That's a quote from ABC News reporting on Sutherland Springs. Emergency medical services then arrive and face chaotic, fluid scenes. Victims in pews or on sidewalks, confused family members, and, at times, conflicting witness reports. The FBI's study of active shooter incidents between 2000 and 2013 found that these situations develop quickly and unpredictably, and the first responders' timeline matters enormously to the survival outcomes. The FBI study notes patterns intended to help structure rapid response and life-saving actions in those first crucial moments.
187, 1042. 187,
Chester 1960.
Police and first responder tactics have evolved. After Columbine and other high-profile attacks, law enforcement doctrine shifted toward immediate engagement of active shooters rather than waiting for SWAT-style containment. That change cuts minutes from command decision timelines and, for many victims, can mean the difference between life and death. A few more quick facts about the immediate aftermath and the incident profile. Major analysis consistently show a variety of attacker profiles and durations. Some incidents end in minutes, others in longer chases. The Rocky Mountain Institute's Mass Shooting Fact Sheet, updated through 2025, aggregates high-level trends in mass shootings across decades, useful for context when people ask how frequent or likely these events are. Emotionally, witnesses describe acute shock and disassociation, the brain trying to protect itself. One common behavior is compartmentalization in the first hours. People report numbness, disbelief, repeating simple actions, or moving through the aftermath on autopilot. That's normal. It's the body's stress reaction in full force. As the immediate medical response wraps up, law enforcement and investigators shift into what can feel like a parallel, slow-moving world. Evidence collection, scene preservation, witness interviews, and chain of custody logistics. Even when a suspect is killed on scene or captured soon after, investigations can take months or longer. And that slow clock often heightens survivors' anxiety. The FBI and the Office for Victims of Crime make specialized victim assistance teams available after mass casualty events. The FBI says its Victim Services Division informs, supports, and assists victims in navigating the aftermath of a crime and the criminal justice process. In other words, they not only gather evidence, but also try to help families with notifications and resource navigation. From a timeline perspective, consider the difference between what the family experiences and what the criminal justice system is doing. Families want immediate answers. Who did this? Why? When will the funerals happen? Investigators are often still cataloging evidence, performing ballistic tests, and trying to reconstruct timelines. That disconnect can create a devastating sense of helplessness. In the months after the Tree of Life synagogue attack in Pittsburgh in October of 2018, families talked about how the slow legal process, trials, and sentencing phases reopened grief in cycles every time a court date appeared in the news. It's important to note, investigators also balance transparency and the need to protect the integrity of the case, so survivors are often left waiting for official details. Community leaders can help bridge that gap by providing clear, compassionate communication while respecting the investigatory process.
Calling all units. We have 211 at 454 South Main.
Car 36 responding. Officers are on the scene. Be advised, suspect is armed and extremely dangerous.
During investigation phases, families frequently need legal and social service navigation, how to get death certificates, how to work with insurance, how to obtain victim compensation, and how to coordinate public memorial services. The Department of Justice and the Office for Victims of Crime offer toolkits and victim assistance guidance specifically for mass violence incidents that list steps communities can take to support victims and families during the legal process. The first 24 to 72 hours bring immediate social and logistical shocks. Family notification, coroners, and the presence of local and national media. For family notification, the objective is accuracy and compassion, but the process is often painfully slow. Officials must confirm identities and next of kin before any public release, a process that can exacerbate family members' trauma and uncertainty. Media attention is a double-edged sword. It can raise awareness and mobilize supports, but it can also traumatize survivors through repeated exposure to images and stories. The Tree of Life shooting coverage, for example, ignited national attention to anti-Semitic violence. But survivors and journalists later described how the repeated replaying of images and testimonies reopened wounds during anniversaries and trials. Faith leaders play a unique role in the days after an attack. They are shepherds of grief and public faces for their congregations. They coordinate memorials, manage influxes of support, and sometimes also become targets of both community expectation and political criticism. Pastors, rabbis, and imams often find themselves balancing theological responses, trying to frame the tragedy within spiritual teachings, while making urgent practical decisions about burials, counseling, and security. In reporting on Sutherland Springs, survivors described the surreal reality of ongoing worship and mourning. People returned to the same pews where violence occurred, trying to make sense of ordinary rituals in new, traumatized bodies. In the words of one survivor, "I could see death." That's from Time reporting, Sutherland Springs survivor accounts. Faith communities often must make rapid decisions about whether to cancel services, hold private vigils, or move forward with public memorials. These decisions will shape short-term healing, but they also carry security implications that leadership must consider in tandem. Now let's talk about the long term. Mental health outcomes, spiritual consequences, persistent fear, and resilience. Research shows that survivors of mass shootings experience elevated rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and complicated grief. Studies of campus shootings and other mass trauma events have documented persistent post-traumatic symptoms months after the event, with resource loss, like losing social supports, predicting worse outcomes. Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, Guidance for Mass Violence Behavioral Health notes distinct phases of response and recovery. In the acute phase, the first days and weeks, people commonly experience shock, denial, anger, and difficulty concentrating. SAMHSA recommends psychological first aid and other brief support interventions during this phase. In later phases, survivors may need a more sustained trauma-focused therapy or community interventions. Collective trauma is another dimension. Whole communities, including worshipers who were not physically present, feel the aftershocks. The American Psychological Association has noted that cumulative effect of repeated mass shootings is raising general levels of stress and can dull social compassion over time. A phenomenon that adds another layer to recovery for faith communities who previously relied on openness and hospitality. Here are practical, evidence-based supports that help survivors in the medium to long term. Immediate psychological first aid and crisis counselors available in the first days. SAMHSA recommends mobilizing trained counselors. Ongoing trauma-informed therapy options, example, cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, where appropriate. See SAMHSA guidance for community mental health planning after mass violence. Peer support groups and faith-based counseling that integrate grief, spiritual questioning, and practical recovery steps. Localized victim services and community mental health clinics are often listed by state and federal victim service offices. Writing about the long shadow of mass shootings, a 2022 piece by the American Psychological Association, APA, explained that mass shootings are raising Americans' mental health, heightening stress and dulling compassion, and that repeated exposure to mass violence reshapes how communities feel safe and trust one another. Clinically, PTSD is common but not universal. Survivors' outcomes hinge on exposure level, social supports, pre-existing mental health conditions, and access to services. That's why rapid, equitable mental health deployment matters, and why faith communities can be critical delivery partners for ongoing support. Moving into months and years, communities wrestle with memory and meaning, how to memorialize, whether to rebuild in the same location, and how to balance openness with security. The Tree of Life community, for instance, chose to rebuild and use memorials and music as central parts of their healing process, even as they navigated a complicated legal and public landscape. In terms of prevention and security, there are several reoccurring lessons from house of worship attacks. Security is a balance. Churches want to remain welcoming while also reducing vulnerability. The Washington Post and other outlets have summarized research showing houses of worship are rare but particularly lethal when targeted. Open-door traditions create vulnerability that must be thoughtfully addressed. Training and preparedness saves lives. Local training for safety teams, active shooter drills, medical training, such as stop the bleed and CPR, and communications plans for notifying congregants and families are all recommended by federal and nonprofit resources. SAMHSA and the FBI provide behavioral health and victim service frameworks to support these efforts. After action reviews, communities that survive mass violence often undertake formal reviews to identify gaps in procedures and update emergency plans, including signage, access control options, and arrival and exit flow planning. Beyond congregational steps, researchers call for broader policy measures, including data collection, mental health funding, and community-based violence intervention programs to reduce the frequency and lethality of mass attacks. The Mass Shooting Fact Sheet, updated through 2025, provides longer-term trend data that policy groups rely on when advocating for changes. As we close, I want to give listeners concrete resources embedded into the conversation so you have help when a community needs it. If you're a survivor or a family member seeking immediate federal-level help, the FBI's Victim Services Division can assist you with navigating the criminal justice process and connecting you to local services. The FBI describes its victim services as a suite of supports for victims involved in FBI investigations. For mental health and disaster behavioral health, planning after mass violence, SAMHSA has a mass violence behavioral health toolkit and guidance on psychological first aid and community-based disaster response. SAMHSA emphasizes staging supports throughout acute, intermediate, and longer-term recovery phases. If your congregation is forming a mental health response plan, start with SAMHSA's resources. The Office of Victims of Crime, OVC, and the Department of Justice offer practical toolkits on mass violence incident victim assistance. Everything from logistics for family notification to guidelines for memorial planning and legal assistance referrals. If you lead a faith community, consider small steps today. Create an emergency notification plan, identify 3 congregation members with first aid training, and set up a trusted communications tree so family notification is clear and centralized after any incident. If you're a listener who's been affected, reach out to local crisis lines. And if you're in the U.S., look at SAMHSA's disaster support pages or contact your state's mental health hotline. Here are a couple numbers to get you started. For SAMHSA Disaster Distress Hotline, call 1-800-985-5990. For the Mental Health Crisis Hotline, 866-865-8211. For the FBI Victims Connect Resource Center, call 855-4-VICTIM. That's 855-484-2846. And for the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, dial or text 988. Finally, remember, recovery is not a straight line. Trauma, faith, grief, and resilience can coexist. Communities rebuild in different ways, sometimes quietly, sometimes publicly, and often with a combination of anger, devotion, service, and memory. Thank you for listening carefully today. If this episode landed on something painful for you, please reach out to a friend, a faith leader, or a professional. We'll keep covering what's needed to make houses of worship safer and healthier for everyone. As always, y'all stay safe and y'all stay blessed.